He was and remains the man in black. His powerful songs won the hearts of country music fans, rockers, and prisoners alike. I am, of course, talking about the legendary Johnny Cash. But many, including Cash himself, would argue that his success was due to the Canadian behind the curtains. Saul Holiff from London, Ontario, managed Johnny Cash from 1960 to 1973. That era saw Folsom Prison, San Quentin, A Boy Named Sue, and then addiction, divorce, remarriage, arrests, and trials. But just as Johnny's career peaked, Saul Holiff quit. The reason for this has remained a mystery, and when Saul took his life 2 years ago, he took the answer with him. Saul Holiff's son, John, locker belonging to his father, containing old articles, playbills, and hours of an audio diary. Now Jonathan is using this material as the basis for a feature-length documentary and a book titled My Father and the Man in Black, and we've reached Jonathan in studio in Los Angeles. Welcome to Q.
Thank you, Jian.
Good to talk to you, Jonathan. How did your father, a Jewish guy from London, Ontario, hook up with a hard-living singer from the Bible Belt?
Saul started out as a rock and roll promoter in London, Ontario, back in the late 50s. In 1957, he brought Bill Haley and the Comets to London, and he followed that up with the Everly Brothers. He put a 16-year-old Paul Anka on the bill with Jimmy Rogers, also in 57, and many others, including Carl Perkins, Jerry Lee Lewis, Chuck Berry. Till one day in 1958, he decided to book a band called Johnny Cash and the Tennessee Two. And their first meeting was not a good one. According to Saul's diaries, Johnny glowered all evening, and they didn't hit it off at all. But regardless, Saul brought him back a couple of more times. And then finally, in May of 1961, booked Johnny on a tour of Ontario. And it was during that tour that they became friends, and Johnny asked Saul to manage him.
And is it true that Johnny said, sign this on a piece of paper and said, now we have a contract, now you're my manager?
No, not at all. In fact, quite the opposite. They never had a written contract in the many years they knew each other. It was they drafted notes. Johnny came off a plane in Newfoundland for another tour with some basic notes on a page, but they never actually executed a contract, which of course is unheard of today. But back in those days, a handshake was all it took.
Right. So your dad, Saul, he becomes Johnny Cash's manager all through the 1960s, up until 1973. What kind of a relationship did these two men have?
Well, in a word, volatile. As you pointed out in your intro, these were the interesting years, the important years, the years that everybody talks about. It was a period where Johnny was addicted to drugs in a very serious way and getting arrested all the time. In fact, within 1 week of Saul joining Johnny as his manager, Johnny was arrested for the first time in Nashville in November 1961 on a drunken disorderly charge and put in the drunk tank for a night. And just 1 week later, while playing 10 dates at the Cave in Vancouver, Johnny trashed the Hotel Georgia while trying to break down the door of the room of a love interest of his, who was Billie Jean, the widow of Johnny Horton, one of Johnny's best friends, who had died a few months before that. So,
and how would Saul deal with this, with these kind of incidents?
Well, that evolved over the years, as you can imagine. That was the first time, to my knowledge, it was definitely the first time during their relationship that they were kicked out of the hotel and told never to return. And that happened over and over and over again over the years. Saul would, in the beginning, go to great lengths to try to protect his client. Later on, when June came along in 61, who, by the way, my father hired and matched with Johnny for the Big D at Jamboree in Dallas in 61.
And the rest is history between those two.
Yeah, and by the way, it completely contradicts what we see in Walk the Line, but we can talk about that in a minute.
Sorry, why don't you tell me now? What part of the June Carter Cash part contradicts what we see in Walk the Line?
Well, first, let me say that I loved the movie. It was a great love story. Many people who outside the industry tend to forget that what they see in a Hollywood movie is not necessarily a fact or factual. For example, In the early part of the movie, we see June driving around in an old black Chevy with Johnny Cash, Jerry Lee Lewis, and Elvis Presley going from gig to gig to gig in the late 50s. That never happened. That was all invented backstory to lend weight to this love story that the writer-producers were telling in that movie. The truth is, June and Johnny never spoke to each other for more than 1 minute before Saul hired June in December of '61 and put them together.
Mm. Yeah, I'm curious about what you knew. I mean, you were a little kid, obviously, while Saul was managing Johnny Cash. What do you remember about those years? Do you have much recollection of that? Because this is part of this story is about you rediscovering your father's relationship with Johnny Cash, and I want to get to that. But first of all, tell me when you were a small kid, what do you remember about Johnny Cash and your dad?
Sure, I can tell you that my feelings for Johnny changed over the years. When I was very young, my father was always away, and every time I asked for him, my mother or our nanny would say, "He's with Johnny Cash." So when I was that small, I couldn't distinguish between my father and Johnny Cash, and I believed at the time that my father was Johnny Cash. Later, when my father took form as I grew a little older, I began to, I think, probably resent Johnny a little bit because I blamed him for taking my father away for such long periods of time. And then a few years later, when I was watching cartoons and, the Justice League and Superman and all that stuff, I started to fall in love with Johnny Cash because to me he was a living, breathing superhero, 6'4" and deep baritone voice and...
Jonathan, you became Saul. Your dad quits managing Johnny Cash in 1973, and really since then, you became quite estranged from your father. And even when he died a couple of years ago, you didn't really have that much to do with him. And then one day, you discover your father's storage locker. Tell me about this incident and how things changed for you.
Sure. I went to Canada to escape my father's shadow. I equated show business with emotional disturbance. I was going to turn over a new leaf, start a new chapter, and 3 months later, Walk the Line opens. And the next day, an article is published in the London Free Press called Saul Holiff Deserves Role in Biopic. And then our phone starts ringing off the hook, and it doesn't stop. The media wants to know what we think of the movie. Biographers are calling, wanting to know if anything's left of Saul's files from his days with Johnny. I had been home now for 4 months, and I said to these people, listen, we're in mourning, and there's nothing here, please respect our privacy. But they were persistent. They called back, and a month later, this one particular fellow had me on the phone asking me again if anything survived those years, and I said no. And all of a sudden, my mother tapped me on the shoulder and said, that's not quite true, son. And she pulled open the center drawer of my father's desk, and inside was a key. And the key led to a storage locker, and as it turns out, Saul had kept everything, not just from his time with Johnny, but about his whole life. In all, there were over 26 cartons of material, and it was just flabbergasting.
And including that material, these audio diaries that your father he taped telephone conversations with Johnny Cash. Why did he do that?
Well, first of all, that was the biggest surprise. I didn't set out to write a documentary or a book. I came to this reluctantly as a hostile witness, and I realized that I couldn't move past my father, and that this represented an opportunity for me to sort of wade into my father's life and explore him and try to understand him and hopefully make peace with him. But when I discovered those diaries, the audio, more than 60 hours, it became apparent that it could become a documentary.
Why did he make those tapes?
Well, he made them for several reasons. One, believe in psychiatrists or shrinks. He would never see one. So I believe that first and foremost, it was a form of self-analysis. As for the telephone calls, that's a slightly more complicated issue, but I can say that it was never to have the goods on Johnny Cash. It was never to write a tell-all book. Saul was retired and not working for 40 years. He had plenty of time to do those things, but he never did. It wasn't his style. The reason he did it was because I found in exploring these materials, starting in the early 1960s, because Johnny was so addicted to pills, he had a split personality. There was the good Johnny and there was the bad Johnny. And the bad Johnny didn't have a very good memory. And consequently, Saul would set up dates and fees and locations, and then the next day Johnny would say, I didn't agree to that. So Saul started a practice, as evidenced in these letters that I found, of having witnesses to their conversations so that he could later say, John, listen, you did agree to this, and we are doing this. And when technology allowed, when it became possible to tape phone calls, that was just an extension of that.
Okay, Jonathan, you've been kind enough to let us to lend us one of these. I don't even know if this has ever been heard before. One of these telephone conversations, the audio of it. I want to play a bit of it here. We've got one of those conversations. This is between Saul Holiff and Johnny Cash, recorded in 1972. Here they're talking about The Gospel Road, the movie about the life of Jesus that Johnny starred in. The first voice you'll hear here is Johnny Cash.
Now, there's a couple of things I want to say to you that I need to clear the air completely with you on.
Mm-hmm.
First of all, I knew way before I even did the film that there's a lot of people, maybe the majority of the people, are not going to buy what I'm saying in this film or what the film is saying. So you see, I don't really have to be told that because I know that.
I haven't, you say you don't have to be told that, but who said that?
You did. You said, in the dressing room at Saratoga, you said you realize, of course, that a lot of people are not going to agree with your film.
Well, when I make a statement like that, that's what is known as trying to be honest, because, first of all, if you take 100 people, 25 of them are Christian faith and 20 of them are Muslims, and 10, that's what I meant.
Yeah, but I knew that originally, see.
Yeah.
Well, I just felt like that you didn't have a lot of interest in this film, and I just wanted to know if you don't, then I'll go ahead and do what I can do without you.
I'm one of the few people that try to say to you exactly what they think without meaning to be harmful. I'm not trying to break things down. I'm just trying to maybe temper things a little bit by saying not exactly what people think you want to hear.
Yeah, right.
I find a lot of people tell you exactly what you want to hear.
Yeah, I know that. I don't need that either.
And that doesn't help.
No, it doesn't.
Well, that's Saul Holiff talking to his client, Johnny Cash, there. And Saul Holiff, who managed Johnny Cash from 1960 to 1973. I'm speaking to Jonathan Holiff, his son, who's writing a book and making a documentary film about the life of his dad managing Johnny Cash. Jonathan, I've got so much to ask you. There's so much here. I appreciate you coming up. Before I let you go, now that you, in the course of making this documentary and writing this book, and now that you're getting this insight into your dad's life and Johnny Cash, what do you think about Saul now?
I think I've made peace with him. I have to tell you, listening to my father's voice when he was my age, I'm 42 now, and these diaries started around the time he was my age, was a very spooky and emotional experience. But he detailed and chronicled his own battles with addiction, his alcoholism, his gambling in the stock market. He lamented his long absences from home. He would talk about coming home and not even the dog would recognize him. So I found empathy for my father, and given what he went through with Johnny Cash in the 1960s, I think most people would forgive him his own foibles. It was quite a story.
Thanks for joining us today.
My pleasure.
Much appreciated. Jonathan Holiff is the son of Saul Holiff, the man who managed Johnny Cash through his rise to fame. Jonathan's documentary and book, both titled My Father and the Man in Black, are due out in 2009.